Welcome to Reading with Nana, and hello again to my special returning friends. We are continuing with the novel Heidi by Johanna Springway. We are on chapter 10, entitled A Grandmama. The following evening, a spirit of anticipatory excitement surged through the house. Tinette had put on a new cap. Sebastian was placing footstools in front of nearly every armchair, and Miss Rottenmeier walked with great dignity about the house, inspecting everything. When the carriage at last drove up, the servants flew downstairs, followed by Miss Rottenmeier in the more measured step. Heidi had been sent to her room to await further orders, but it was not long before Tinette opened the door and said brusquely, "Go into the study." The grandmamma, with her kind and loving way, immediately befriended the child and made her feel as if she had known her always. To the housekeeper's great mortification, she called the child Heidi, remarking to Miss Rottenmeier, "If somebody's name is Heidi, I call her so." The housekeeper soon found that she had to respect the grandmother's ways and opinions. Mrs. Sesemann always knew what was going on in the house the minute she entered it. On the following afternoon, Claire was resting, and the old lady had shut her eyes for 5 minutes when she got up again and went into the dining room. With a suspicion that the housekeeper was probably asleep, she went to this lady's room, knocking loudly on the door. After a while, somebody stirred inside, and with a bewildered face, Miss Rottenmeier appeared, staring at the unexpected visitor. "Miss Rottenmeier, where is the child? How does she pass her time? I want to know," said Miss Sisman. "She just sits in her room, not moving a finger. She has not the slightest desire to do something useful, and that is why she thinks of such absurd things that one can hardly mention them in polite society. I should do exactly the same thing if I were left alone like that. Please bring her to my room now. I want to show her some pretty books I have brought with me." "That is just the trouble. What would she do with the books? In all this time, she has not learned her ABCs, for it is impossible to instill any knowledge into this being. If Mr. Candidate was not as patient as an angel, he would have given up teaching her long ago. How strange! The child does not look to me like one who cannot learn the ABCs," said Mrs. Sesemann. "Please fetch her now. We can look at the pictures anyway." The housekeeper was going to say more, but the old lady had turned already and gone to her room. She was thinking over what she had heard about Heidi, making up her mind to look into the matter. Heidi had come and was looking with wondering eyes at the splendid pictures in the large books that Grandmamma was showing her. Suddenly she screamed aloud, for there on the picture she saw a peaceful flock grazing on a green pasture. In the middle, a shepherd was standing, leaning on a crook. The setting sun was shedding a golden light over everything. With glowing eyes, Heidi devoured the scene, but suddenly she began to sob violently. The grandmamma took her little hand in hers and said in the most soothing voice, "Come, child, you must not cry. Did this remind you of something? Now stop, and I'll tell you the story tonight. There are lovely stories in this book that people can read and tell. Dry your tears now, darling. I must ask you something. Stand up now and look at me. Now we are merry again." Heidi did not stop at once, but the kind lady gave her ample time to compose herself, saying from time to time, "Now it's all over. Now we'll be merry again." When the child was quiet at last, she said, "Tell me how your lessons are going. What have you learnt, child? Tell me." "Nothing," sighed Heidi. "But I knew that I never could learn it." "What is that you can't learn?" "I can't learn to read. It is too hard." "What next? Who gave you this information?" "Peter told me, and he tried over and over again, but he could not do it, for it is too hard." "Well, what kind of boy is he?" "Heidi, you must not believe what Peter tells you, but try for yourself. I am sure you had your thoughts elsewhere when Mr. Candidate showed you the letters." "It's no use," Heidi said with such a tone as if she was resigned to her fate. "I'm going to tell you something, Heidi," said the kind lady now. "You have not learned to read, because you have believed what Peter said. You shall believe me now, and I predict that you will learn in a very short time, as a great many other children do that are like you and not like Peter. When you can read, I'm going to give you this book. You have seen the shepherd on the green pasture. Then you'll be able to find out all the strange things that happened to him. Yes, you can hear the whole story and what he does with his sheep and his goats. You would like to know, wouldn't you, Heidi? Heidi had listened attentively and said now with sparkling eyes, if only I could read already. It won't be long. I can see that. Come now and let us go to Clara. With that, they both went over to the study. Since the day of Heidi's attempted flight, a great change had come over the child. She had realized that it would hurt her kind friends if she tried to go home again. She knew now that she could not leave, as her Aunt Detta had promised, for they all, especially Clara and her father and the old lady, would think her ungrateful. But the burden grew heavier in her heart, and she lost her appetite and got paler and paler. She could not get to sleep at night, as she would lay there and long for the mountains with the flowers and the sunshine. Only in her dreams she would be happy. When she would wake in the morning, she would always find herself on the high white bed, very far away from home. Burying her head in the pillow, she would weep for a long, long time. Mrs. Sesame did notice the child's unhappiness, but she let a few days pass by in hopes for a change. But the change never came, and she could see that Heidi's eyes were red from the early morning hours. So one particular day, she called the child to her room. With a deep sympathy in her voice, she said, tell me, Heidi, what is the matter with you? What is making you so sad? But as Heidi did not want to appear thankless, she replied sadly, I can't tell you. No? Can't you tell Clara, perhaps? Oh, no, I can't tell anyone, Heidi said, looking so unhappy that the old lady's heart was filled with pity. I tell you something, little girl, she continued. If you have a sorrow that you cannot tell to anyone, you can go to our Father in heaven. You can tell him everything that troubles you, and if we ask him, he can help us and take our suffering away. Do you understand me, child? Don't you pray every night? Don't you thank him for all his gifts and ask him to protect you from evil? Oh, no, I never do that, replied the child. Have you ever prayed, Heidi? Do you know what I mean? I only prayed with my first grandmother, but it was so long ago that I have forgotten. See, Heidi, I understand now why you are so unhappy. We all need somebody to help us. And just think how wonderful it is to be able to go to the Lord when something distresses us and causes us pain. We can tell him everything and ask him to comfort us when nobody else can do it. He can give us happiness and joy. Heidi was gladdened by these tidings and asked, can we tell him everything? Yes, Heidi, everything. The child, withdrawing her hand from the grandmama, said hurriedly, can I go now? Yes, of course, was the reply. And with this, Heidi ran to her room. Sitting down on a stool, she folded her hands and poured out her heart to God, imploring him to help her and let her go home to her grandfather. About a week later, Mr. Candidate asked to see Mrs. Sesame to tell her of something unusual that had occurred. Being called to the lady's room, he began, Mrs. Sesame, something has happened that I never expected. And with many more words, the happy grandmama was told that Heidi had suddenly learned to read with the utmost correctness, most rare with beginners. Many things happen in this world, Miss Sesamon remarked, while they went over to the study to witness Heidi's new accomplishment. Heidi was sitting close to Clara, reading her a story. She seemed amazed at the strange new world that had opened up before her. At supper, Heidi found the large book with the beautiful pictures on her plate. And looking doubtfully at Grandmama, she saw the old lady nod. Now it belongs to you, Heidi, she said. Forever? Can I take it with me when I'm going home? Heidi inquired, overcome with joy. Certainly, forever, Grandma assured her. Tomorrow we shall begin to read it. But Heidi, you must not go home. No, not for many years, Clara exclaimed. Especially when Grandmama goes away. You must stay with me. Heidi continued studying her new book as she lay in bed that night. The book had become her dearest treasure. She would look at the beautiful pictures and read all the stories aloud to Clara. Grandmama would quietly listen and explain a little about it here and there, adding only to the beauty of the stories. Heidi loved the picture of the shepherd boy best of all. It was the story of the prodigal son who was seen in the first picture working in the fields with his father's sheep. But the next picture showed the boy after he had run away from his father's house. There he sat in a pig pen eating the pig's food. The third picture was best of all. The penitent boy is seen in his raggedy clothes and thin wasted figure running back to his father's home. There in the picture, you could see the father's arms open and outstretched, welcoming his son back home. This was Heidi's favorite story, and she would read it again and again until she knew it by heart. The days with Grandmama just seemed to fly by, but eventually the time came for Grandmama to depart. In Chapter 10, Heidi's learned to read. Chapter 11, the title says, Heidi gains in some respects, the reading, and loses in others. The grandmama sent for Heidi every day after dinner, while Clara was resting and after Miss Rotmeyer had retired into her room. She talked to Heidi and amused her in various ways, showing her how to make clothes for pretty little dolls that she had brought. Heidi showed a natural gifting for sewing. She picked up on the sewing lessons quickly, making the sweetest dresses and coats for the little dolls out of lovely materials provided by Grandmama. Often Heidi would read to the old lady, for the more often she read over the stories, the dearer they became to her. The child would put herself in the stories and would always find a little happiness when she found herself together with the characters in the tales. However, she was never so cheerful as before, and she had lost the merry sparkle in her eyes. In the last week of Mrs. Sessomon's stay, Heidi was called again to the old lady's room. As the child entered with her beloved book under her arm, Miss Sessamon drew Heidi close to her, and laying the book aside, she said, Come, child, and tell me why you are so sad. Do you still have the same sorrow? Yes, Heidi replied. Did you confide it to our Lord? Yes. Do you pray to him every day that he may make you happy again and take your affliction away? Oh no, I don't pray anymore. What do I hear, Heidi? Why don't you pray? It does not help, for God has not listened. I don't wonder, she added, for if all the people in Frankfurt pray every night, he cannot listen to them all. I am sure he has not heard me. Really? Why are you so sure? Because I have prayed for the same thing many, many weeks, and God has not done what I have asked him. That is not the way, Heidi. You see, God in heaven is a good father to all of us, who knows what we need better than we do. When something we ask for is not good for us, he gives us something much better if we confide in him and do not lose confidence in his love. I am sure what you have asked for was not very good for you just now. He has heard you, for he can hear the prayers of all the people in the world at the same time, because he is God Almighty and not a mortal or person, man like us. He heard your prayers and said to himself, Yes, Heidi shall get what she is praying for in time. Now, while God was looking down on you to hear prayers, you lost confidence and went away from him. If God does not hear your prayers anymore, he will forget you also and let you go. Don't you want to go back to him, Heidi, and ask for his forgiveness? Pray to him every day and hope in him that he may bring cheer and happiness to you. Heidi had been listening attentively, hanging on to every word the grandmother was saying to her. These words of spiritual life seemed to make a deep impression upon her. In a spirit of genuine heartfelt repentance, she said, I shall go at once and ask our Father to pardon me. I shall never forget him any more. That's right, Heidi. I am sure he will help you in time, if you only trust him, the grandmother consoled her. Heidi went to room now and prayed earnestly to God that he would forgive her and fulfill her wish. The day of departure had come, but Mrs. Sessamon arranged everything in such a way that the children hardly realized she was actually going. Still, everything was empty and quiet when she had gone, and the children hardly knew how to pass their time. The next day, Heidi came to Clara in the afternoon and said, Can I always read to you now, Clara? Clara assented, and Heidi began. But she did not get very far, for the story she was reading told of a grandmother's death. Suddenly she cried aloud, Oh, now grandmother is dead, and wept in the most pitiful fashion. Whatever Heidi read always seemed real to her, and now she thought it was her own grandmother at home. Louder and louder she sobbed. Now poor grandmother is dead, and I can never see her anymore, and I never took her a single roll as I had promised. Clara attempted to explain the mistake, but Heidi was too upset now to listen. She imagined how terrible it would be if her dear old grandfather would die too, while she was so far away. How quiet and empty would be in the hut, and how lonely she would be. Miss Rottenmeier had overheard what had happened. She approached the sobbing child and chided Heidi in an impatient tone. Adelheid, now you have screamed enough. If I hear you losing control of yourself like this one more time, I shall take your book away forever. Heidi turned pale at that suggestion, for the book was her greatest treasure. Quickly drying her tears, she choked down her sobs. After that, Heidi never cried again. Often she could hardly repress her sobs and was obliged to make the strangest faces to keep herself from crying out. Clara would look at her emotional responses in surprise, but Miss Rottenmeier failed to notice them and found no occasion to carry out her threat. However, the poor child grew more cheerless every day and looked so thin and pale that Sebastian became worried. He tried to encourage her at the dinner table to help herself to more of the good food before her, but Heidi would hardly touch the food. In the evenings, she would cry quietly to herself. All the while, her heart was bursting with longing to go home. Thus the time passed by. Heidi never knew if it was summer or winter, for the walls lining the city streets never changed. They left the home very seldom, for Clara was only able to go short distances at a time. They never saw anything other than streets, houses, and busy people rushing to and fro. There was no grass, no fir trees, no mountains to be seen. Heidi struggled with her sorrow, but alas, it was in vain. Autumn and winter had passed, and Heidi realized that the time was coming for Peter to take the goats up into the Alps, where the flowers were glistening in the sunshine and the mountains were all afire. She would sit down in a corner of her room and put both hands over her eyes so as to not see the glaring sunlight shining on the opposite wall. There she would remain, her heart aching with a longing, until Clara would call for her to come. That's the end of our story. This is a sad little girl who has a lot going on in her life. She's realized she is a help to the people where she is and doesn't want to feel ungrateful. Yet at the same time, she misses her family at home. Have you ever felt that way? You were okay where you are, but you wanted to be somewhere else? How did you manage that? We see it's not easy for Heidi. Click like or subscribe. Until next time.